morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to this webinar, and I think that Refat is going to say the first few words, and he is going to welcome everyone. So, for those who don't know it yet, please, if you need to listen in another language, we have interpretation in Arabic, in French, Spanish, and Portuguese. So you need to click on the icon below, and hopefully you can find it. And over to you, Refat. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. I will speak in Arabic. So, مساء الخير للجميع. صباح الخير أيضا للجميع أينما كنتم. أود تقديم بالشكر لسكرتارية الحملة العالمية للتعليم لهذا الجهد العظيم في تنظيم هذا الأسبوع، أسبوع العمل العالمي للتعليم، وتحديدا هذا العام لما لهذا الأسبوع وعنوانه من أهمية إنهاء الاستعمار في مجال تمويل التعليم. هذا الأسبوع تاريخيا استطاعت الحملة من خلاله تسليط الضوء على قضايا حساسة وقضايا ذات أولوية للجميع. هذا الأسبوع هو أسبوع حاضني لكل المجتمع المدني في جميع أنحاء العالم. استطاعت الحملة العالمية للتعليم من خلال هذا الأسبوع تجميع وتجسيد صوت واحد ضد المظلومية في كل أنحاء العالم، وتحديدا أولئك الذين يحرمون من التعليم لأسباب عديدة ومختلفة. كما نعلم جميعا نحن نعمل لتحقيق الهدف الرابع، ولكن هذا الهدف الرابع الخاص بالتعليم لا يمكن تحقيقه بدون قضايا أساسية، منها موازنات كافية للتعليم. وهذه الموازنات الكافية للتعليم أيضا لا يمكن أن تتحقق بدون سيادة الدول على مقدراتها، سيادة الدول على أحقيتها في جمع الضرائب، وتحديدا من الشركات الافتراضية أو الشركات متعددة الكبرى متعددة الجنسيات التي تحاول أحيانا التهرب من الضريبة، وأيضا قدرة الدول على تخفيف ديونها أو حتى إسقاط الديون عن بعض الدول. هذا الأسبوع بعنوان انهاء الاستعمار في مجال تمويل التعليم هو يسلط الضوء أيضا على أن الاستعمار ما زال باقيا وما زال قائما. الاستعمار يقدم نفسه الآن بطريقة مختلفة، يقدم نفسه وكأنه منقذ للشعوب والدول الفقيرة بالارتكاز على الادعاء أن هناك نقص في قدرات هذه الدول، هناك عدم قدرة كما يدعون لهذه الدول على عدم قدرة على إدارة مقدراتها ومصادرها، وبالتالي هذه الدول بالمنطق التي يدعونه والفكرة التي يحاولون تسويقها أن هذه الدول غير قادرة على إدارة مصادرها، وبالتالي يعطوا لأنفسهم الحق بالتدخل بشؤون هذه الدول، وخاصة في مجال التعليم. لا نخفي، يعني ليس خافيا على أحد أن هذه الفكرة أيضا تخفي وراءها طموح تجاري من هذه الدول اتجاه الدول النامية. من جهة أخرى التعاونيات الدولية التي تحاول أن تساعد هذه الدول ليس مطلوب منها التدخل في محتوى التعليم في هذه البلدان. ونود التذكير أن عند الحديث عن نوعية التعليم هناك إشكالية في أنه يتم الحديث عن نوعية التعليم بمعزل عن الحديث عن العلاقة ما بين محتوى التعليم وثقافة الدول، ما بين محتوى التعليم في هذه الدول وتاريخها. وبالتالي محاولة التدخل من هذه التعاونيات الدولية في حجة مساعدة الدول وبالتالي فرض سياساتها أحيانا تصل لحد المطالبة بإلغاء محتوى مناهج أو أساليب تدريس أو إعادة إصلاح منظومة تعليمية، هذا لا يجب أن يكون. وبالتالي هذا الأسبوع أيضا يسلط الضوء على هذه القضية المهمة في هذا الشأن. والنقطة الأخرى فيما يتعلق عندما نتحدث عن الموازنات، زيادة الموازنات بحد ذاتها ليس المطلب، يعني ليس هدفنا فقط أن يكون هناك زيادات تمويلية للتعليم. إذا لم تقترن هذه الموازنات في عدالة اجتماعية وعدالة اقتصادية وعدالة سياسية فلا معنى للمطالبة بزيادة التعليم. يعني ماذا يعني أن تزيد موازنة التعليم إذا لم يكن هناك سياسات إدماج عادلة، إذا لم يكن هناك سياسات مساواة عادلة، إذا لم يكن هناك تحقيق لعدالة اجتماعية في هذه البلد أو تلك. لهذا السبب هذا الأسبوع شعاره الاستثمار في تعليم عادل. هذه الجملة لها دلالة كبيرة جدا في عمل الحمل العالمي للتعليم. لهذا جزء من عملنا هو أن نركز أيضا على مجانية التعليم في كل مكوناته وتداعياته. كون هذا الشعار أيضا يحمي حق الفقراء من الوصول للتعليم. أكرر شكري للجميع وخاصة المتحدثين الآن في هذا اليوم، شكر جزيلا لهم لأن يكونوا بيننا. وأكرر شكري أيضا لكل أعضاء الحمل العالمي للتعليم سكرتيرية الحمل العالمي للتعليم، وعلى رأسهم الصديق والأخ جرانت. شكرا جزيلا لكم.
Thank you very much, Refat, for these inspiring words. And now I would like to welcome again everyone. And I hope that you can understand that for language interpretation, you need to click on the globe. So maybe the interpreters can write that on the chat. We also have a function for questions and answers that you can use. Feel free to use the chat as well to ask your questions, because we don't have a lot of time. We have a really distinguished panelist who will be talking about the importance of decolonizing education financing. Education is a right. It's not charity, it's not a privilege, it's not a commodity. But when education is not adequately financed, then we see that the right to education suffers and many people cannot enjoy it. And we see that historically, it has been chronically underfunded. And we see that this is a political choice, right? For far too long, we have been focusing only on the share of the budget. This is still very important. And again, as you probably know, the minimum should be between 15 and 20% of the national budget should be going to education financing. And this should be between 4 and 6% of the GDP. We see that very few countries actually achieve this. But even those who do often struggle to adequately fund education. And this is because we will also need to increase the size of the budget. Because when we have a small pie, even a big portion of the pie would still let us hungry. So we really need to increase the pie. Also to stop avoiding this fight against public services in this zero-sum game. We shouldn't be fighting against health. We shouldn't be fighting against water and sanitation. We really need to increase it. How are we going to do that? We really need taxation, progressive taxation to do this. We need to stop giving away vast sums of money in tax holidays, in harmful tax incentives. We really need to stop illicit financial flows. Really, global tax abuse is $483 billion every year that we are losing. This would be more than enough to fund education, the SDG 4, even more than enough to fund all the SDGs. So it's really time to do that. But instead, what we are seeing is a push for austerity, is a push to increase interest rates, to really bring down public spending at a time where we have a huge shortage of teachers. Teachers are the main expenditure on education. These are the recurring costs, and they really rely on domestic financing because they are the only ones that can pay teachers year after year, no donors. But in total, like education financing relies on domestic financing, which is 97% of the total education financing. Only 3% comes from donors and from loans, right? However, this 3% has been shaping the education policy for far too long, and it really has a colonial lens. It really has this extractivist, perspective, and really, like you could say, like neo-colonial supremacist. And we really need to take control in that sense. That's why we need to decolonize education financing. We need to stop using so much money, so much of the national budget into debt repayment services at the moment that we are living of the debt crisis, when some countries are going into debt default and are asking the IMF to rescue them. These conditionalities, again, are bringing down the investment that education should be to protect this right. So now, without much further ado, I'm going to introduce our first panelist, Professor Atiyah Warris, who is the UN independent expert on foreign debt and human rights. Atiyah, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today. I'm delighted to be able to speak to an audience that I have not actually previously spoken with, which is the people working in the education sector. And being an academic, it's something that I watch very carefully. I'm affected by actually directly, which I will mention in the course of my presentation. When I was asked to speak about the fiscal implications around education, I started to really reflect on my own personal life and the struggles that people in my part of the world, which is Kenya in East Africa, are facing as we go along. And one of the things happening in my region is that actually teachers are now demonstrating on the streets. There are question marks about whether or not people will receive their salaries on a monthly basis. And this actually further destabilizes the sector. And as Maria has pointed out, the core person, it really is the teacher, which I fully agree with. So when I looked at issues around debt, illicit financial flows, and taxation, it's very clear that we need to spend on the education part of it. It's also very clear we need to spend on other human rights and on the SDGs. But SDG 17 is the one that talks about bringing international cooperation together, revitalizing global partnerships. And this is particularly the one that strikes me as having the greatest challenge in the world that we're living in right now. So this particular SDG is struggling, but I'm going to talk about 8 specific points. Some of them are hopefully some solutions to consider, but I will also talk about the challenges. So the first one is the issue around debt conditionalities. So there's 2 types of debt. There's public debt and there's private debt. When it comes to public debt, then that is entities like the IMF that we talk about. I have written to the IMF several times asking them questions about their interest rates, about surcharges, additional interest rates when countries default. And one of the things that I've seen is that there is a rise in conditionalities that are connected to taxation. So normally debt conditionalities would remind us of, for example, the structural adjustment programs. But what is the reality on the ground right now is that there is a lot of direction on where taxes are placed, from whom they're collected, and from whom they're not collected. So why there are tax breaks, tax exemptions, tax holidays becomes a big question mark in many countries across the world, because the taxpayers' money is what is used to pay public debt. Then we come to private debt, and private debt is usually attached to a particular infrastructure. But in that whole process, that circular economy in a country that's happening, the whole purpose of the infrastructure that's being developed is that, people are going to use it, it's going to give you revenue, the revenue then generated through this infrastructure that is then used to then make a profit that pays off the private debt. But the same way the tax is the circular economy, people are working, goods are being brought into an economy, and then the tax is scooped up to the public debt. That particular infrastructure that's built is supposed to make a profit for the private debt to be paid off. And currently the struggle is in both spaces. In both spaces, they are unable to collect enough to pay off the debts. So then what starts to happen? A delay in payment of recurrent expenditure is one of the first ones. A stop in further development. So many developing countries will say that they have maybe 10% development on an annual basis. What starts to happen is that gap just goes down to a zero. And so what you have is a shift in the economy completely and a redirection of financing going outwards without enough left to sort of circulate inside a country. So that's sort of the scenario that we're living in right now. But the biggest challenge facing many of these developing countries across the world, and in fact, some developed countries as well, is to ensure that there is economic stability. The effect of debt is twofold. First, you lose the revenue that would otherwise be floating in your economy. Then the second is you lose the utility of that money moving in the economy. So if I'm a teacher, which I am, then I get my revenue, I then use it to go shopping, I buy my milk, the farmer gets money for sale of milk, and then the economy is circulating. Keeping this economy stable is very, very crucial for most governments, and they are suffering tremendously with trying to trade off paying off debts and keeping the economy stable. And why are they doing that? They're doing that because we have credit rating agencies in the world. They are 4 companies housed only in one country in the world. They are private, and they actually assess the reliability of a country. They rate it, they tell you what level it's at, they tell you if you invest in them, will you actually get returns back? And then they declare countries as junk status. Now, when these things happen, the immediate effect is that it hits on the value of the currency of that country. Suddenly, your dollar, which was at 110 of your currency to the dollar, will become 150 or 200. And I'm peculiarly reminded about Argentina, where I was last year. And when I landed in the country, Argentina was 248 pesos to the dollar. That evening, it was 284 pesos to the dollar. And as of last week, it was 500 pesos to the dollar. So even when we talk about tax to GDP and size of economy and making sure education is stable and the teachers are stable, that same teacher that was earning at 248 pesos to the dollar is now earning at 500, which is half that value. But the prices of goods have gone double. And that is what you start to see, which takes me to the next point, my third one, on issues of privatization and commerce and private sector. So this same public sector employee, education person, teacher, is now engaging with the private sector seller of goods and services. But because they are private, they can change the value of their goods to meet the changes in the currency levels. Obviously, they should, because otherwise they will not be able to make a profit. But the person who's earning the salary or the revenue cannot do the same thing. So what you have is a mismatch. You have in one space, which is the private spaces, where private sector and commerce is able to actually recalibrate its values, financial values, for whatever goods and services you give and receive. And then you have these public sector spaces and actors who include a lot of the teachers across the world who actually have no negotiation power in that space. Right? So you have this mismatch. And so then that brings me to the whole issue of privatization of human rights, because now we also have a huge group of private universities, schools, kindergartens that create almost like a parallel economy within different spaces. And they don't always use a human rights lens. I was very struck recently when I discovered that although in most public entities across the developing world, you now do have affirmative action policies, 50% girl child, boy child. But when you go into private sector education spaces, the same rules are not being applied. So this lack of application of a human rights lens is not just the fiscal lens. It is actually the entire private sector lens that we have to really consider and make sure that they share in these principles and rights. And then that takes me to my fourth point, which is the pay structure I've already mentioned, but also the infrastructure support. Whenever there is this trade-off between whether or not to pay off debt or whether or not to develop a certain part of the country versus improving the pay of the teachers, the tradition has been to put the teachers in a union which is, of course, the only way to deal with it. There are huge numbers of teachers. But this same union process is very different in different parts of the world. And sometimes they're not able to negotiate better pay. They are limited by so many challenges on their way to that position. And we just had May Day, which is Labor Day. And I was reminded that on Labor Day, the unionized teachers don't always get a raise in some parts of the world. So the unionization and the financialization process is a different process in different parts of the world, depending on who you are. So many of the teachers have to wait until their collective bargaining agreements come into play. Now, this mismatch and missteps in this process is what I was trying to look at while I reflected on today's sessions. My fifth point is the discussion around COVID. We are now slowly moving away from COVID. However, in many developing countries, online learning is being maintained because many have found that it is easier as teachers to now build on that and continue to find other spaces to work. That is very worrying because it is because of the limitation of the finances attached to the teaching sector. But there is also questions of quality and impact. I have been to countries where there was no online learning availed to people in rural areas, in indigenous spaces, minority spaces. And I think this is something also that the debt conditionalities, taxation, is not really redirecting infrastructure changes to. And that takes me to my sixth point. Over the process of the SDGs, we have seen a development of the opening up of spaces to diverse stakeholders. You now have corporations in these stakeholders. You have pharmaceutical companies looking at medical research, or you have private educational institutions or establishments. But you also have private sector players operating in human rights spaces that were traditionally kept for civil society and academia. And what has started to happen is this recalibration with the input of new stakeholders means that the voice of the lobbyists is always the loudest with those who have the best ability. And unfortunately, it is the financial ability that allows people to travel to spaces where leaders are in order to influence those spaces. And it's really important as we open up the spaces to partnerships, which can also be for the good, that we are aware that that rebalancing or calibration, and I would like to say perhaps the whole colonization concept that people are speaking about already this afternoon is a reflection of how the settled modes of operation and engagement are affecting also fiscal spaces now. But then this break takes me to the seventh point. And one of the things that I have seen in my fiscal spaces is that whereas normally you would try and widen tax spaces and ensure that those that are not on the tax base will be added to the tax base, that spaces become formalized. And when I say informality becoming formal, I don't mean individuals on the ground. I also see multinational corporations that work informally completely. I see small and medium-sized enterprises, and it's got a lot to do with the weakness in trust and faith that people have in a government. But this has a direct effect on its ability to secure resources to spend on its formal spending, specifically teachers in the spaces in which they operate. And so I'd like to conclude with my last point, which is I would like to see solutions to the space. So whenever I look at issues around fiscal systems, and in this particular case, financing education, I always look at 7 specific principles. First, the issue of, which I call fiscal legitimacy, which is how fiscally legitimate is education financing and how does it operate as a result? So of course, you have to look at the whole financing bubble first, and then you have to look at the financing education part of it. And in all of these issues that I've discussed, the first one is about transparency. How transparent is the system? How engaged are people in these spaces of financing education? The second is about responsibility. Who gets held responsible when things go wrong? What happens if the wrong books were brought in for a particular education system that's being implemented? Who gets to be held responsible when there are delays in books coming into public schools? There isn't a lot of clarity in these spaces. Then there is accountability. So who gets held accountable for all of these decisions? Where is the balance between financing or paying off debt and then financing rights? Then we come to two issues that very often you hear across government, issues of efficiency and effectiveness. So it's always about how efficiently you're using finances. Well, if you do not educate your people and they do not grow and then get jobs, then those same people who would normally be paying taxes and building your economy will now not be paying taxes and not building the economy because they cannot get better jobs. So there is a circular connection to all of these spaces. And so then about effectiveness, these decisions, if they're not efficient, are also then not effective. But when I come to the last part of fiscal legitimacy, for me, it's about the fairness and the justice in the space. It's about reducing inequalities. It's about ensuring that the vulnerable are getting more and more access to spaces they couldn't get access to. And I'm minded to say that as more and more developing countries develop these bigger and bigger cadres of educated populations, we are now entering the era where you have inherited firms. We're moving away from the generation of a first generation educated. We're now moving to a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth generation of education in families. And the thing is that then there is also capture of jobs, of professions, because each one is passing these down to the other. And these become family traditions. And while that is wonderful, we have to always make sure we keep space for those of us who still remain outside those spaces, who need access to it. And if we do not push back on issues around debt, on illicit financial flows, taxation, ensure there is equality and reduce the inequalities in the system, I fear sometimes that we will not move much further than where we are today. I thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to the discussions. Maria.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Atiyah Waris. Thank you for reminding us and explaining so eloquently how debt is not only bad for human rights and for education, it is bad for the economy. How this prioritization of debt repayment services, how this impact of the Moody and all these like so biased, right? Particularly towards low and income countries. So thank you very much also for explaining about the 4 R's of the tax justice, the need to increase revenue, the redistribution, repricing, and representation, as well as you were saying, accountability, right? That we don't have that with the private. So without much further ado, now I'm going to introduce Dr. Manos Antonini, who is the director of the Global Education Monitoring Report. Manos, you know a lot about the privatization as well of education because of this year. So please, over to you.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, colleagues at the Global Campaign for Education for inviting me to address you in this session. It's true that decolonization is a term, and colonization, but it's a term that is or happened to come from a country that has not been colonized and has not colonized, at least not for a few thousand years. And therefore, it is a term which gives me some opportunity to look at it externally. It was great listening to Dr. Waris about the perspective, especially the last principles. And I think I would like to echo the points she made. I will share my screen just because I also, by sheer coincidence, have eight points to make. And I just wanted the audience to be able to follow by putting them all on one slide. So just allow me to put that up and then help you follow my presentation a bit more easily. So I think the points that were raised really eloquently before come up also in my presentation. The issue of domestic resource mobilization, but also expenditure is the first question. And then this is a very delicate issue because how much of the problems that we see in countries these days are really related to colonization, and how much is it related to national choices and policies followed. It is, of course, now going back to like 2 generations, 60 years, where most countries have been independent. So how much of the policy choices can be ascribed to colonization? It's a very, very, very important and very interesting question. And I would say there is still a link, and I think we cannot downplay it. I think it is the issue of how societies in many countries have been segregated and have created certain elites, perhaps even more powerfully so than in other countries. And these do affect how choices are made in terms of paying attention to the more vulnerable and more disadvantaged groups in society. Now, can we really say it is colonization's fault after such a long time? That's something, a question that I leave to you. But I think one very important policy question, and especially in Africa, where the vast majority of children are being taught in a language that they don't speak at home. Here you have a very interesting case where colonization still has an influence, in the sense that some countries are trying to introduce national languages of instruction, and that's, of course, a key mechanism to help ground education systems to the realities of people. But you also see opposition because, of course, there are some political elites who perhaps are not so keen to see that. So this is just one example of how equity and inclusion questions and the internal allocation of resources in countries may be carrying the legacy of colonization. It is an issue that countries need themselves to grapple with. But the very important question, and that's something we have done in the Global Education Monitoring Report, is to estimate the cost it would take for countries to achieve not perhaps the universal target of SDG 4 that we know by now are no longer feasible and achievable, but the national targets that countries set as part of the process we call National SDG 4 Benchmark. We published a paper in April on the occasion of the meeting between education ministers and finance ministers at the spring meetings, where we estimated that even with quite optimistic assumptions about the revenue raising capabilities of countries and their commitment to spend up to 20% of their budget on education, there would still be a gap of $97 billion per year between now and 2030, just to achieve the less ambitious, still ambitious, but not perhaps overly ambitious target that countries have themselves set. So that raises the question, where are these resources going to come from? We did hear, of course, Maria referring to the $435 billion as an example. But we know that the largest part of that actually is owed to the rich countries themselves rather than to the poor countries. So I think even if we were to get, even if the poor countries were to get their fair share of what is owed to them, perhaps that would not still be enough. So still there is some potential scope for aid. And here we have a very interesting question between countries that are trying to delink themselves from aid, from external financing, and countries that still realistically still need it for the years to come. And the question there becomes an issue of how such aid is, first of all, distributed between countries. And here we see clear patterns related to history and national interest of the donor countries. And that's that also needs to break, because we need to allocate support to countries where it's due. And I think I see that you have the Global Partnership for Education. You won't often hear me saying great things about the GPE, but I think it is important to acknowledge that GPE has made a huge difference in ensuring a far more equal allocation of resources between countries that is not tied to any particular historical interest. And I think that's the way to go for all aid. But there's more to be done on that front, and that is about how it's designed. And in our report on foundational learning in Africa, the first edition of the Spotlight report, as we call it, which is in association with ADEA and the African Union, we put particular emphasis on the fact that a lot of the projects are really unsustainable, in the sense that they allocate per student perhaps 20 or 30 times more than countries themselves can afford to spend, but also do not focus sufficiently on institutions. And that means essentially that a lot of this external support ultimately gets recycled and is returned to the providers of the technical services. And that's another area where so much more could be achieved, but by better long-term design and planning. That brings me then to the third set of issues related to global agenda setting. I will not say too much about international financial institutions already. I think it was eloquently covered, and I'm sure more will come also from the speakers.
There is a problem. The interpretation for Spanish is coming up. I don't know what has changed, but we can hear it. Please continue, Manos.
So I will not say much about international financial institutions. I said I come from a country that that may not have colonized or have been colonized, but it emerged from a huge, perhaps the biggest financial crisis in recent memory. And yes, indeed, there are very interesting views about the respective responsibility of the country and of the institutions and the countries that lend its resources. I won't go to that very, very sensitive topic, but I think it's very important to remember that the IMF really paying very little, leaving the debt aside, very, very little attention to issues of spending in social services. It is remarkable, in fact, that the responsibility for reporting on one of the SDG global indicators, indicator 1A2, which is the percentage of the budget that is spent on education, health, and social protection, has been now assigned to the IMF. And yet the IMF does not collect information on how each country allocates its budget on social services. That, I think, is indicative and a sign of essentially how such spending is treated with some contempt. And I think that's also something that needs to change. Again, I will not say much about my sixth point here, which is the slow progress in acting on tax evasion and avoidance. We had a window of opportunity, but I understand that action has been relatively meek and still slow in being implemented. So that is something that we should not forget. But more generally, I think it's also to a large extent linked to external financing. It is very important for countries in the global north to have respect to national and regional processes of priority setting. And I think it was already remarked upon how some of that influence is perhaps monopolized by certain agendas and certain opportunities that some people have to reach out to global leaders and influence their way of thinking, but also sometimes overriding national priorities as expressed by some groups. And I think that's really key. And that brings me to the last point, which is about target setting. I already mentioned in our last attempt to cost the achievement of targets, we focused on the targets that we invited countries themselves to set. The National SDG 4 benchmark was a process that the countries agreed upon, committed upon in 2015. So the GEM reports and the UNESCO Institute for Statistics have worked with countries over the last 2 or 3 years. And by now we have 3 or 4 countries having set their own national targets for 2025 and 2030 for 7 key indicators of the global agenda. And now we're in the process of perhaps adding 1 or 2 more that have come out of the Transforming Education Summit. One is on commitment to climate change education, and another one is on commitment to internet connectivity at the school level. And I would say this is really very important for many reasons, but the one reason that we should not forget is that it is countries that should be leading the process. We cannot be telling countries what to achieve, assuming that the policy process is contested at the national level, that people's voice is listened to and acted upon. National targets should have the priority, and given that Leonardo is following me, an appeal to him, given that he's the pen holder for the policy brief for the Summit of the Future, please do maintain the focus of the international community on having national SDG 4 benchmarks in the coming years as a driver of policy change and an effort and a way to remind countries and also for the people to remind their governments where their priorities should lie, and to try to influence these priorities towards ever more ambition and commitment. With that, I leave you here, and I would like to thank you very much for having invited me.
Thank you very much, Manos. Great. And I really want to thank again the Global Education Monitoring Report for having this really wealth of data and analysis that is just so useful for all of us. So for those who are not using it yet, please do share the link as well, Manos. And particularly, you didn't cover it in your presentation, but I know that you have been particularly last year, when you were talking about the privatization of education, the private actors in education, how they have been increasing also as a result of this defunding of inadequate financing of education, how the for-profit sector is really pushing hard, and this has some really negative consequences. So thank you very much again, Manus. And now I would like to give the floor to
the reason I didn't do that
Leonardo
is because
Garnier.
in 2 months, in 2 months' time, we're launching our next report on technology and education.
Exactly.
And therefore, we are gearing to that topic and trying to separate that between the two
Yes,
sides.
but please
Thank
do
you very much,
feel free to share it in the chat as well, so people can see it as well. So now the next speaker is Mr. Leonardo Garnier, who is the UN Special Advisor for the 2022 Transforming Education Summit. So Leonardo, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be part of this gathering. And I would like to talk about the paradox of educational investment. You know, it's been 50 years since the publication of Sakharopoulos' seminal book, Returns to Education and International Comparison, where he demonstrated rigorously what we already knew both from intuition and from experience. In simple economic terms, education pays. 5 decades of research have confirmed this time and again. Investing in education is one of the best, if not the best, investment a country can make to improve the material well-being of its population, as reflected both by its income and by many other indicators of the quality of life. Of course, education is much more than merely an investment with very high rates of financial return. Education, as we know, is a human right, and it implies every person's right to be an active, productive, happy, and significant members of society. However, even though we know these things, as of today, the combination of long-standing poverty, increasing inequality, misguided policies, the impact of the pandemic, they are leaving a vast majority of children, particularly the poor, with so little education that it is estimated that only 3 out of 10 would be able to read and understand a simple text by age 10. That means that roughly we're living out 2/3 of the world. Out in some ways, out from the opportunities, but too close to the shopping malls, to the windows that showcase the wildest array of goods that are in supply for anybody who is anybody to enjoy, but not for them. Consumption and conspicuous consumption has never been higher in human history. But left out of the education, 2/3 of those living in this planet will struggle just to survive in low-paying jobs, if they get a job at all. You know that whiskey caskets are being aged in the space station at this moment. Or we know that Coldplay entertained a rich guy's daughter wedding. And that 3 other rich guys took their friends for a tour in space, while 2/3 of humanity don't have the opportunity to learn even the basics. This is the crazy world we are living in. We know that we are failing in education. We also know how to fix it. It's not complicated. It takes teachers, it takes schools, it takes some learning resources from books and notebooks to tablets or PCs and internet access. We could add school meals and a few other basic conveniences to facilitate learning. Not much to ask, just the right to learn. So the question is, why is it that we don't do it? There is no physical space. There are other priorities. Those are the answers we usually receive when we ask for more investing in education. And that's a wrong answer. Let me use a very few numbers. Today, we are investing roughly 5 trillion in education in the world. That is about 6% of global GDP. The problem is that even though most children live in low and lower middle income countries, most of our educational investment is concentrated in high income countries. High income countries account for 63% of global investment in education, but they only have 10% of the school-age population. Very different is the situation of lower middle income countries, which with only 8% of global investment must serve 50%, half of the world's school-age population. And it's even worse for low-income countries. They have 25% of the world's school-age population with only 0.6% of global investment in education. This unequal distribution of education investment translates, of course, into a global reproduction of educational inequality, as the amount of resources each country can invest per school-age person is completely different. Roughly, per capita spending in education is over $8,000 a year in high-income countries. 8,000. It is about 1,000 in upper middle-income countries. It's only $300 in lower middle-income countries and merely $50 per year per person in low-income countries. That is $1 per week per school-age person. You don't have to be an expert in education to understand what that means. It means that unequal educational investment reproduces and widens social and economic inequality. This is absurd. Investing in education should be seen not only as a moral and political imperative, which it is, but it should also be understood as a sensible economic investment. There is plenty of evidence, as I said, that education pays. Recently, the World Economic Forum summarized many of such evidence, arguing that a single dollar invested in education at the primary or secondary level yields $2.50 in additional gross lifetime earnings in lower middle income countries, and as much as $5 in lower income countries. That is a 500% return of investment. And these are only the private returns. If we were to add the economic impact of indirect benefits or externalities of education, we would find, for example, that for every dollar spent on early childhood development, interventions yields $13 in economic returns. So yes, the figures that would be needed, as Manos was saying, to be invested for everyone in the world to have access to a decent education are large, but they are not as large as to grant the assumption that we can't do something about it. Of course we could if we really wanted to. So the question is, why is it then that countries do not invest more in education? Why don't they invest a higher proportion of their GDP, a higher proportion of their national budget, but especially why don't they increase their investment per school-age person? Why is there such a strong opposition for progressive revamping of tax systems that could increase the tax to GDP ratio and open more fiscal space for financing education? And for answering these questions, and here we're talking about decolonization, and yes, we need to understand that there is a very strong relation between the kind of development a country has and the kind of education that comes with it. Let me put it in very simple terms. When a country is highly unequal and has a large supply of very cheap labor, it can find itself in a low-level equilibrium, to use economic terms, or in a poverty trap, to put it more bluntly. The type of investment most easily attracted by the abundance of cheap labor are typically unsophisticated investments with low capital intensity, low productivity, little need for human capital, but still they can be very profitable. Not because they contribute with increasing productivity, but because of their continued access to low-cost human and natural resources. With no need for increasing qualified labor force, there is very little incentive in such an economy for raising taxes to finance education, which is perceived as a mere expenditure. The situation can be even more complicated when countries get entangled into the typical race to the bottom, where they deregulate the labor market, the exploitation of natural resources, they devalue their currencies and grant generous tax exemptions and access to tax havens to further reduce costs and attract foreign investment, as Atiya was mentioning before. And there is very strong pressure, local and global, to reproduce this race to the bottom in which countries compete among themselves for selling their resources cheaper and cheaper. It's, again, the culture of neocolonialism. Furthermore, in countries where these extractive or low productivity economies prevail, the institutional framework tends to be weak, and the balance of economic and political power is significantly skewed towards the upper echelons of income and wealth, which again tend to oppose the kind of progressive taxation that would be necessary to finance universal quality education. So it becomes difficult to do what should be done. And what is it that should be done? Atiya already mentioned most of it. First, governments should promote ambitious progressive tax reforms to widen the necessary fiscal space for sustainable investing in education. The fiscal space is not a data, it's not a fact, it's something that can be decided politically. We have to increase, of course, the percentage of GDP of public budgets going to education, but especially we should look at increasing public per capita investment in education, which is what really matters. And in terms of increasing progressive taxes, the 7 points made by Atiya are critical here. Second, multilateral agencies and global institutions should show more coherence so that they put their advice where their research is. We see many of the research by the World Bank and the IMF and many of these institutions talking about the importance of human capital, the importance of investing in education. Okay, they should be promoting more investment in education instead of pressuring countries with austerity measures that restrict spending in public wages, including teacher wages. They should also advance with additional research to look at other potential sources of global financing for education, including global wealth taxes, taxes on global profits, or taxes on specific sectors or activities. And finally, we need urgent action to tackle the high cost of debt and rising risks of debt distress for many countries. To escape the poverty trap, we need to invest in education, but the political economy of poverty trap curtails the capacity to invest in education, even though such an investment makes perfect economic sense. Short-term profits will not allow it. So it will the poverty trap and embark on the virtuous cycle of sustainable development, increasing wages, increasing productivity, expanding and improving education, making sustainable use of natural resources, and strengthening political institutions. But yes, it will take a movement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leonardo. Like really inspiring words. Really good as well, as you pointed out, the huge inequalities that there are between countries. And also what we are not saying, right, is that these countries actually are being like the global tax abuse, even when it is smaller, as Manos pointed out, in terms of total number in low and middle income countries, it is a huge percentage, right, of their GDP that they are losing. And this is actually depriving people from their human rights. And I just would like to say that the tax havens are not only islands in the Caribbean, like rich countries are really acting as tax havens, particularly the UK and its crown dependencies, the US and many others. I also wanted to mention when Leonardo was talking about the human capital approach, that we have to be very much aware that there is an instrumental value of education that can be, as Leonardo said, private, but also social. But we also have the intrinsic value of education that again can be private and social. And the human rights discourse should really be there, because otherwise we could run into some problems of the rate of returns, and then some individuals could be more profitable than others. So we always have to bring the two discourses together, and if in doubt, bring the human rights, which is stronger. Now, last but not least, we have Magdalena Sepúlveda, who is the commissioner for is one of the commissioners for the Independent Commission for International Cooperation on Tax Reform, ICRIC, as well as the Global Initiative for Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. So Magdalena, over to you. Thank you.
Many thanks, Maria, and thank you for the organizers for inviting me to this very timely discussion. And I would like to start a little bit with the context. So if we talk about financing education, we need to realize that this is a very difficult question in the time that we're living. So the battle against the global pandemic have left many developing countries with massive debts, as it has been highlighted before. In addition, they're facing escalating energy and food prices, higher interest rate, and a more volatile capital flow. So this is a very difficult situation, but it's not the only situation. In addition to all of that, the whole world is facing multiple and interlinked crises, such as the climate emergency, the historic levels of inequality, and the shrinking of democratic space. These multiple crises are not a coincidence. It is not, as many people would like to portray, a perfect storm, that a metaphor that somehow refers to the fact that it will be a temporary coincidence. This is much more persistent. It is caused by structural factors that perpetuates disparities in the realization of human rights, including the right to education. And the effect or the impact of these multiple crises, as usual, disproportionately impact the most disadvantaged and marginalized group of society. So women, persons with disability, minorities, indigenous peoples, LGBTI people, migrants, refugees are those who have been impacted the most. So how a state can provide funding to education in this very difficult economic context? So there are possibilities, and unfortunately, instead of increasing taxation to public services such as education, healthcare, and a care system, what states are doing is just the contrary. They are implementing austerity programs. They are cutting public services, they are increasing consumption taxes such as VAT, and not only that, they are increasing privatization and deregularization. So this is really problematic. Why they're doing so? Of course, for many developing countries, they are being forced by the international financial institution. And here is where one of the neocolonial aspects of the discussion comes very right in. Why? We have to say that this is insanity at its best. The international financial institutions are asking states to do the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, the definition of insanity. So we have seen this in the past, in Latin America, the region where I come from, we have seen it for decades. We have seen it after the economic and financial crisis of 2008, and the results are the same. They disproportionately impact and have a devastating effect on people that live in poverty and the most vulnerable and disadvantaged group of society. And something that it also should be said, they are impacting disproportionately women and girls who have been already very affected by the pandemic. And I think that one has to be very clear and direct here. Cutting social expenditure, cutting social spending can only be possible because women make up of the shortfall through unpaid care and domestic work, reducing their time for paid employment, political activity, leisure, and impacting enormously their health. But as it has been discussed by previous panelists, austerity cuts are not inevitable. They are an alternative that could increase the revenue to finance education as well as other services. We have one of those options are restructuring debt. We can also talk about the importance of ODI, in particular if we're talking about decolonization, and special drawing rights could also be a possibility. The alternative that I'm going to refer now, it's an alternative that it is particularly decolonizing the financing of education. And it is a very simple alternative, and this is to increase taxation in those who have failed to pay their fair share of taxes and who has, on top of that, benefited with the COVID-19 pandemic. And for these actors, multinational corporations and the super rich. And in here, what we need to understand is that the existing system for taxing the global profit of multinational corporations is not only obsolete, but it's unfair. This system is the one that enables systemic tax avoidance by large multinational corporations, depriving states of the resources that they need in order to invest in education and other public services. This system, of course, fostered and exacerbated inequality, not only within countries, but also between countries. When tax haven exists, there is no possibility to raise the needed amount of revenues to finance education or other public services. If we don't address the systemic issues that allow corporations to avoid paying the fair share of taxes, and if we don't take all decisions to tackle this unfair system, we're not going to resolve the situation. And the current system is, of course, the result of colonialism. A recent tax deal that could have more directly tackled the issue of tax avoidance and tax haven has been negotiated, as it has been negotiated for the last 30 years or so by the OECD, the Club of Rich Countries, in the so-called inclusive framework of BEPS, the base erosion and profit shifting. The OECD in recent years has taken steps in the right direction. Let's recognize that as well. It has established a global minimum effective corporate tax rate, and it has moved towards unitary taxation of multinationals. However, the agreement reached at the OECD has fallen short of responding to the current challenges. It is not enough. For example, it has set a low minimum global tax rate in 15%. This is very low. It will bring an estimate of 220 billion in additional revenues globally, while a 25 tax minimum rate, that it was the one that ICRIT, Independent Commission for the Reform of Corporate Income Tax, in which I am a member, has been advocating for, could have generated 500 billion a year. It's a big difference. And more importantly, the agreement reflects the current power relationship of the symmetries in power between the global north and the global south. The agreement reached by the OECD under the BEPS is benefiting principally developing countries and is really bringing very little revenue to developing countries where resources are needed the most in order to finance education. These are, of course, political choices, and there is an important role that civil society and other actors can play to change the situation. There are other ways also to increase progressive taxation. And the current situation that I just explained, it's happening at the moment in which some large multinational corporations, in particular in fossil fuel, in food, in pharmaceutical, have been seeing record profits worldwide. So another option is that the state have a choice to do is that the state can tax this windfall profit of companies in this time of record and abnormal profit in order to have a more progressive fiscal space. In order to finalize, I wanted to stress some of the points regarding human rights that other colleagues have been mentioning. And you, Maria, that has been constantly reminding us of the human rights approach. Human rights are not just values. These are obligations. These are obligations that have been assumed voluntarily by state through international human rights treaties, but they have also assumed this obligation domestically in their constitutions, in their bills of rights. And a very important principle that we find in most countries around the world is the principle of equality and non-discrimination. And this is an essential principle that should govern and guide progressive taxation. And we can see how the impact of taxation is very unequal if we see, for example, if we compare the tax rates paid by multinational corporations on one hand, almost zero, and the ones that are paid by medium and small enterprises. So the national small and medium enterprises are not benefiting equally. But of course, the domestic tax system also have a very disproportionate impact. Indirect taxes, such as BIT, have an enormous impact on those living in poverty. They pay, in reality, a tax rate much higher in BIT than in the proportion of their income that those paid by upper sector of the society. And human rights has a word to say here. Human rights should guide progressive fiscal reform and should also guide the reform of the international tax system. And what is very important is that we do have an opportunity to do something about it. Thanks to the African group at the UN level, last year, the UN General Assembly approved a resolution that will start the intergovernmental discussion for more effective tax cooperation and tax system. And at the UN level, it is the right forum to discuss that issue. Each country, one vote is very different than what we see at the OECD, in which, despite all the efforts for being inclusive, all countries do not weight the same. So, and again, I would like to also comment on the fact that organizations working on the right to education are putting financing issues on top of the agenda. This is absolutely right. The human rights movement in general, for us, it has taken, and this is self-criticism, as I identify myself from the human rights movement, we have taken so long to put the issue of tax revenue at the heart of the realization of rights. And with that, we are giving governments the tools to bring the austerity card or the lack of resources card. When we have to go back to them and say, yes, we are, as I said at the beginning, in a very difficult economic environment, but as Leonardo said, the fiscal space is not fixed. The state can take measures to increase their fiscal space, and they should start doing so by making those who have benefited the most from the COVID-19 pandemic pay their fair share of taxes, multinational and the super rich. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Magdalena. That was great. Again, very, very, very inspiring. And just to see that it's not only the bad thing that even when it keeps being recommended to put more into the VAT or sales taxes, right? And even when we know that when companies and the wealthy are not paying the fair taxes, people have to pay for public services, people have to pay for education. And that was something that Leonardo and Manos were referring to as well. When countries are spending less per person, then the households have to pay for that as well. And that's the most regressive way of paying for education. Great to hear that there are glimpses of hope, particularly by this UN resolution. We are hoping that we will have a UN tax convention and a UN tax body. And as you said, this is a way of decolonizing the economic financing and the financing of education because of the transparency and the participation and the one country, one vote. So now we have finished this first segment of this webinar with our 4 distinguished panelists, and I would like to thank them again. So, and now the next the next section of this webinar is going to be on taking action to decolonize education financing, proposals and experiences from different places and perspectives. So the first panelist on this section is going to be Haldis Holst, who is Education's International's Deputy General Secretary. So Haldis, if you are ready, please, over to you.
I'm ready, and thank you very much, Maria, for the introduction and the possibility to speak to you. And I want to thank the speakers so far who I think have framed very well the challenge that we stand before, but also that it can be solved if we want to solve it. I was inspired a little bit about references to where are you in the world, to where I'll start. Now, I sit at the moment in one of the richest countries in the world. I'm sitting in Norway. I am Norwegian. But I did have some reflections here on the whole concept of decolonialization. Now, that's a difficult word for a non-native speaker, but I'll try not to stumble too much here in it. This is an issue where we have to, I think, address the issue of decolonialization of financing at the same time as we address what do we use the money that we have to do so we aren't colonializing the way we use our money, if I may say it like that. Today, in my country, this rich country up in the north, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is presenting their report after 5 years of work. Their report is on how we have managed to, what we can say, Norwegianalize our indigenous people and our minorities over generations. That is a means of which we have colonialized within our country because the majority are the colonial power. It's about colonialism is about power. And what the main tool they had was to take away the right to your language, which included to take away the right to education in your language. It was putting the majority country language as the language of instruction. And I think it was Manos that references that. That still happens all over the world. And very often it is the colonial language that is put in as the language of instruction. So at the same time as we desperately need the finances to finance quality education, we also have to be the watchdogs to make sure that how it is used is actually benefiting the children that we want to educate, and specifically the most vulnerable, including minority groups, and acknowledging that being educated in a language that is not yours, that is, I would almost say, abusing the child and the right to education. We must also acknowledge that there are other aspects of how you use the money that can be colonialized. It is about thinking about tools, teaching materials, learning materials, making sure that we are using our investment so that these are developed bottom up. You cannot import teaching and learning materials from a colonial power without at least looking through them and seeing, are these relevant for our children? Do they reflect their culture? Can they identify with them? Are they fit for purpose? We must also make sure that we don't lose the expertise in a country. You can very easily, when you have a small budget, okay, you don't invest in research. So the data and the research you rely on is imported from colonial powers, mostly because it is from the countries with a lot of money. And that means that what is informing your decisions is not bottom up, but is from the outside. So that was, be careful that we also voice what we want to use the finances for. I think all the introductory speakers have made very good cases that, the money is there. It's about having a strong voice and mobilizing on how we get it through fair, progressive taxation systems that also address the cross-country challenges with multinationals and so on, but also in-country. What are the priorities we are making with our budget when we are financing? And I also appreciate that it has been mentioned that teachers are in the core of delivering education. We also know that education is a service that is very, humanly based. And that means that the main cost on any education budget, and it is booked as a cost, are salaries and wages, which means that every time you cut, it means that the teachers out there either won't get their salaries, as Atika was mentioning from Kenya, that they are protesting. We have to see that in multiple countries with the challenges, and that the number of teaching positions are cut. So the impact of teachers and our members, back to that, around the world of what is happening that they see in the classroom is that they're not receiving their salaries. Their classes are so big that it's because of the lack of teachers and the lack of teaching positions, that it's difficult to deliver quality education and quality teaching. This, of course, is seen and experienced, whether it's because they have to do a second job or parents see it, which means that it's difficult to recruit new young people to get into the profession. So we have a negative spiral, and we know that we are lacking. I know that the old number is old now, 69 million is growing, and we will be receiving new data on that, teachers around the world. We will never be able to recruit them if we can't be able to recruit them into a job where you can both be well-trained and also feel that you actually can deliver a good job to do it. On this call, we have the electorate. Civil society is the electorate. That's the people in the country, across the globe. And I think we need to use that collective strength as strategy number one, that one thing is a webinar, but we have to go out on the streets, we have to lobby in governments, we have to get the message across, both in the richer part of the world and in the more disadvantaged part of the world, because at the end of the day, we are the ones that walk and vote, and that they are supposed to build this trust with of how you use the budget and how you use your money. And we mustn't underestimate that power, even if you sometimes can feel powerless when you are out there. And I think the collectiveness is what gives strength. There was a reference to unionizing teachers and rights. And of course, that's what we do at Education International. We are the unions in the education sector around the world. And we try to mobilize that strength both internationally, but also nationally. Nationally, yes, it's about bargaining. In many countries, they don't have the right to bargain. Sometimes because governments are scared of unions, sometimes because it's much easier to determine education as an essential service that we have to keep going, so we can't risk industrial action. There are many reasons why they are pushed aside. They need support in being able to claim their right as citizens, as workers, so that they can influence their own terms and conditions. Globally, we can back each other. One of the things Education International has done is launched the campaign that you can see partially behind my head, Go Public Fund Education, which is all about what this webinar is about, because it's about keeping public control over the finances, and that education is funded in a manner that can deliver quality public education in a manner which can follow up the SDGs and also can follow up the outcomes of the Transforming Education Summit that happened in September last year, whether it's about the financing of education, which was an outcome. It's easy to make commitments at a big meeting, it's more difficult to go home and implement, or whether it's what will be established now, a high-level plan on the teaching profession. Because if you cannot finance the teaching profession and their education and quality of work, you will not have quality education for children around the world. So I know we will continue to stand together. We will continue to do, because we believe in the collective and we believe that we can make a change with it. And I think you've had very many arguments on this webinar of the messages that can be put across. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Haldis. Definitely, if we want good education, we need to invest on teachers, as simple as that, and on education support personnel as well. So thank you very much for this inspiring, again, messages. Before, I forgot that we have a Jamboard open for you, where you can share some ideas of how you see like the best ways of decolonizing education financing. And also, if you click on the next page, then you can share some of your experiences and learning. And my colleague Fabiola is going to be sharing the link very quickly. But we are not doing great with time. So I'm going to now introduce our second panelist for this section, who is Olasupo Abidin, who is the chair of the Brain Builders Youth Initiative and the GCE Youth Action Group member. So Olasupo, over to you. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Maria. And of course, I want to sincerely appreciate every speaker who has spoken on this topic. And it really shows, of course, this is extremely important, and we wouldn't have gotten a better time to address this topic than now. So I'm going to be sharing perspective from the aspect of being a young person as well, and working with the Global Campaign for Education for the last few years. I am from Nigeria, and you'll quite agree with me that Nigeria, like many other countries, are grappling with the issue of decolonizing education financing. So from the perspective of youth and students, I feel, taking action to address this matter is crucial because, of course, it's going to create a more inclusive and more equitable educational system. And I sincerely want to appreciate the Global Campaign for Education for having the Youth Action Group. It is a group like this that young person have, demanded across high-level political forum of the United Nations General Assembly, the Transforming Education Summit, that young persons should have a seat at the table. So seeing organizations like the Global Campaign for Education working the talk to ensure incorporation of youth and students in decision-making process is something worthy of commendation. So as an organization supported by GCE as well, we have hosted series of engagement to cross-fertilize ideas as regards issues around decolonizing education in Nigeria. One thing that always comes forward in issues like this is the government has never been sincere about deliberate investment in education. It is worrisome and disappointing that Nigerians still has over 20 million out-of-school children. We moved from having about 12 to 13 million to 20 million. Yet, government continue to talk about the fact that they pull funding in education. That was the reason why we absolutely agree with the last speaker, Addis, on issues around accountability. It's not just enough for us to advocate for, education decolonization. If we are not going to create a tool to track the promises of some of these governments as well, to see if the proposal we ask them is to increase the financing from maybe 10% to 20%, that we ensure adequate funds are directed towards maybe improving infrastructure, providing quality teaching materials, supporting research and development. And of course, by doing that, especially Nigeria, where I come from, can take a significant step towards decolonizing education. Another major point I would talk about is, diversification of funding sources as well. Relying solely on governments can limit the possibility. And I was quite, glad when other speaker also mentioned that. If we want to talk about transformational stage, there's a need for us to explore alternative sources, such as the public-private partnerships, the philanthropic organization, and corporate social responsibility that could inject fresh resources into education finances. Because the diversification in the long run, reduce dependence on the colonial legacies that we are used to, which is, the government solely, and it will also provide opportunities for local ownership and decision-making in education. Another important point that we'll talk about from our own experience is on the curriculum reform as well. We can't talk about education decolonization without pushing for adequate reform of the curriculum. The education system should go in tandem with 21st century dynamics. A situation where we start teaching skills like artificial intelligence in our primary and secondary school, programming languages, teaching courses like critical thinking, emotional intelligence. It will include diverse perspectives, and it will empower students to critically engage in their own creative way, and of course, be able to compete favorably. So student-led movements should also be empowered. And that's the reason why, again, I will talk about other organizations modeling the Global Campaign for Education. My experience with student-led movements and youth-led movement around the world has inspired a lot of young people as well to take action by, engaging in advocacy campaign, participating in dialogues with policymakers, amplifying voices and demanding changes in education financing, and even collaborating with other civil society organizations as well. Another important thing we should talk about is issues around knowledge exchange program. Like we are having this conversation as well. The reality in Nigeria is not the reality in South Africa, is not the reality in US, is not the reality in UK. Can we have a platform where there will be a knowledge exchange platform where young people, youth, student-led movement, we have an opportunity to come together to discuss issues around educational financing beyond the fact that we continue to ask for a seat at the table. Because one of what I always advocate for is enough of us asking for a seat at the table as a young person. We should find ways to ethically, dismantle that table and ensure that we force ourselves to get into that table so that issues around education and our future, when they are being discussed, we are a part of the process. So I will conclude this speech by saying, not only youth and students in Nigeria have a crucial role to play. Youth globally and students globally have a role to play in taking action to decolonize education financing by advocating for increased government investments, diversification of funding sources, providing scholarships and grant opportunities, reforming the curriculum, and participating in student-led movements, engaging in exchange program as well. I feel the youth and students globally can contribute to creating an education system that is more inclusive, equitable, and reflective of local perspective and needs. So the admonition is to our critical stakeholders on the call as well, that at the core of advocating for this, let us always put youth at the center of this discussion, because in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years, decisions that we are taking today will be a reflections of what our reality will be. So once again, I appreciate the Global Campaign for Education for the opportunity to share my own snippets and my own idea from the data-driven research and engagement we have done in Nigeria around the education decolonization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Avelino. Super, really powerful remarks, and just reminding us that the youth should be there, nothing for us without us, definitely. And also reminding us of the stark reality in Nigeria, of the huge inequalities, a country which is so rich in natural resources, and it's so unequal. It's a huge example, right, of how the colonization and neo-colonization is still very much there in a negative way as well, right? The country with the biggest out-of-school children population, right? And when it has so much money, and particularly like illicit financial flows in Nigeria are huge. So yeah, thank you very much, Abedin. And now we are going to go for our third speaker in this section, who is Mustafa Barghouti, who is a member of the Palestinian Parliament. Mustafa, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And let me greet you all as part of the Global Campaign for Just Education. I'm honored to be with you. I will make a few remarks, 4 or 5 particular remarks and as a follow-up on what has been discussed so far. We're trying not to repeat any what was mentioned. My first point is that when we speak about countries that are out of colonization, sort of speak, I have to re-emphasize the fact that most countries of the world are being recolonized today in a different way. As a matter of fact, at a much lower cost of colonial systems. And I mean by that, this domination of neoliberal capitalism that is leading to very serious structural transformations. And in particular, when it comes to education, it is very clear structural transformation of education, where market forces become the most important determining factor, and where education, like health care, becomes a commodity. So in a way, I think one major point here that we should look at is the fact that there is a process of commodification of education worldwide, where everything is measured by dollars and income and financial income. That leads practically to the loss of citizens' rights. And it was very important to speak about human rights here. But also it leads to the destruction of the whole principle and idea of social contract between the citizens and the state. And add to that the fact that there is an increasing pressure or push to use of dependence on the American approach of dealing with education and research, etc. When it comes to citizens' rights, it was mentioned during the talk that people, especially civil society, should have the right to vote who will be in the government. But in many cases, we don't even have the right to vote. I am a member of a parliament that was dissolved by the government, and no elections were allowed again since 2006. So in reality, struggling for just education means also struggling for democracy and democratic participation. The second point I wanted to make is that through the control of grants, or the image that the control of grants decides the policy, we witness a situation where the donors decide what will be researched and what will be educated, even if their portion of support is very small, and even if much of the funding of education comes really from tax payment. Here comes, of course, the World Bank policies, the influencing the countries so that they would not be able to freely control their resources and their policies. And most importantly, preventing people from deciding their own priorities, whether it comes to education or other aspects of development. My third point is related to the situation we live in Palestine, where I think we have a classical example or a very good example of what colonization does. I mean, our whole history during the last 75 years since the Nakba, where Israel was established on the land of Palestine as a colonial project, is an example of how the whole educational system was destroyed by this colonial project, which was first supported by British and French colonialism, and then later American, I don't know what you call it, imperialism, colonialism, whatever. In a way, we've been subjected not only to the longest occupation in modern history, but also we've been subjugated to a system of apartheid, where really not only our educational system, but everything is affected by that. And there is here a direct and indirect relationship. One example I want to give you is that the external community, the international community, and Israel together enforce on the Palestinian Authority the fact that it should devote 40% of its budget. Yes? Hello? It enforces on the Palestinian Authority the fact that it should spend 40% of its budget on security matters without being able to provide security to its own people. And that means much less money for education or health or agriculture or other aspects. That is one aspect. The other aspect is the pressure we are facing now from external donors, especially European donors, including a decision by the European Parliament to enforce on us changing our curricula, to deny our history, to deny our heritage, to deny our narrative of our life and our struggle. I think these are very clear, direct, and excellent examples of what Palestinians are subjected to. And this shows, I mean, it's not just something that is limited to Palestine, but I think in this case, Palestine can be studied and revealed as a very clear example of all the policies we are witnessing, wrong policies that we are witnessing and that we object to. Two last points I want to mention here that are general and not limited to Palestine. One is the fact that privatization is becoming a very common style, and privatization, in my opinion, hurts proper education from one side, and on the other hand, creates much more discrimination within each society, as well as globally. The rich people can get better quality education, the poor people cannot get proper education, and the lack of resources, of course, leads to low salaries and, in reality, to very low quality of public education. The last point, which is my fifth point, is related to another aspect which should not be neglected, in terms of colonial policy worldwide, which is this policy of using immigration as an instrument to steal away resources from developing countries. We educate young people, we even take them to universities, and when they finish their first degree, they are welcome to be immigrating to other countries, European countries, the United States, and there they become a source of a cheap source of people who are educated that will be used in the economies of these countries. That's happening at the same time when workers are prevented from traveling to these countries or immigrating to them because they want to keep them as cheap labor in their own countries. I think these are examples of how this colonial system affects everybody, and we welcome very much any efforts from your side or whoever would like to study more the situation here in Palestine, because I think it does really reflect overall impact of the colonial policies in the world. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias, señor Mustafa. Les pido disculpas porque por un ratito María se fue, pero ya está de vuelta. Adelante, María.
I'm very sorry. I'm in Nepal at the moment. I just had a power cut, but it was really, really interesting. And thank you very much, Mustafa. I will listen to the end to what I have missed, because it was such a powerful presentation, and really from, as you were saying, the longest occupation, right? And ongoing occupation and the effect it has on education, the commodification of education. Really, really good and powerful presentation. Thank you very much. And now, last but not least, we have Enamul Haq, from a member of CAMPE, Bangladesh. Enamul, are you with us?
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Enamul Haq, working for Campaign for Popular Education, CAMPE, the National Coalition in Bangladesh. So we belong to the Asia Pacific region, the host of about 60% of the world population, largest landmass, and rich natural resource, host of biodiversity, and it is a dynamic economic region for last 4 decades. And if you look at the performances in PISA, you will find a lot of country in this region is at the highest level of PISA, and also one of the happiest region in the world. With those, we have a lot of unsatisfaction as well, particularly the inequality. So in terms of education, Asia Pacific actually face a lot of challenges. About half of the world poorest population live in this region. About 1.14 million people live below the poverty line, and 1% of the richest people hold about 25% of the wealth, so which is really a great concern for us. And we observe that this region has high exposure to the natural disasters, and that is why people lost their life and livelihood quite often and face increased challenge. So enhancing human capability and investment in education could be the game changer. But we saw there was a steady progress in this region, but COVID pandemic reversed the game. There was long school closure that affected the continuity of education and learning loss. Many people lose their job and could not enter into the decent livelihood. And the recent price hike also affected their life and livelihood. On top of that, the education as committed by the states supposed to be free and compulsory for 12 years, but it is not. When you talk about education, then the issue comes that, okay, in terms of education, we need to look into the access and equity. In terms of access, this region has made significant progress. But in terms of quality and relevance, we're really facing a lot of challenge. And management and governance of education is another kind of issue. So to address those globally, we committed to allocate 15 to 20% of budget for education and 4 to 6% of GDP for education. But when the issue comes, how this budget will come, how government will invest, so that provide us a framework, forest framework in terms of size. We are lagging behind in terms of share. Continuously, we are stuck in a certain position which do not ensure or guarantee the realization of the potential. In terms of scrutiny, we can see there are token participation of addressing the inequality, but when the issue of utilization of resource scrutiny, we find data is missing. We don't know how much money has been invested, and those data is never been available in many countries. And participation of civil society is really big challenge in this country, and collective planning and decision making is a big concern. So when we talk about increased financing, government often say allocating resources is not a big issue, utilizing resources is a big issue. Again, when we want to allocate resource, we find that there are really big challenge to allocate resource, particularly during the COVID pandemic. This region suffered huge economic loss, and there was a revenue cut in many countries and job cut in many countries. A large number of people go below the poverty line. So those are some challenge where state needs to invest a lot. We have seen many countries, including Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Timor-Leste, they have huge economic decline in 2020. In terms of, so the issue of aid to education, many of the countries who belong to LDCs become eligible for LDC graduation, and some of the countries in World Bank ranking, they become eligible for middle income country. So ODA flow has been shrinking in this region. So with a disproportionate investment in education and the lowering the ODA, this is really a big challenge. Government often say, we do not have adequate resources, we cannot raise fund. So if you look into why government cannot raise fund, we find that corporate capture is a big issue. The tax avoidance and money flying to the haven is some critical issue. We can see people from Bangladesh is investing money in Canada, in USA. We don't know the source of those money, and those money actually do not benefit the country like Bangladesh. A similar thing happened to many other countries. So how to address those? On top of that, the guideline from the IFIs often put pressure on government to wage cap. So we cannot attract the brilliant in teaching profession and retain them in the teaching profession. There are issues of teachers' competency, recruitment of qualified teachers, and retain them, providing them adequate support. Contact hour is very low. We have a lot of double shift school, and increasingly we can see that there are privatization of education. State is providing modest support to schools, but increasing trend of privatization is kind of policy shift that affect the most marginalized. Particularly, I would like to focus on some of the changes we observe as civil society. In one hand, there are increased pressure on promoting PPP. So it combines with privatization of education. We observe the UNESCO's role. UNESCO is supposed to play a critical role in promoting right to education, but the relationship with UNESCO and their private donation is big issue. there are increased pressure from IMF and World Bank on government planning. And in many cases, we find very little participation of civil society. And private and corporate foundations are increasingly expanding, and many private schools are actually seeking for tax incentive. So those situations actually create a big challenge for the basic education subsector. And as a citizen of a developing country, we believe that SDG 4 provides us a big opportunity that cover range of educational issues, including 7 specific targets from basic education to non-formal education, looking into gender equity, looking into youth development. And the 3 means of implementation give us kind of guarantee that if we can fulfill all those, definitely we can perform better. But in reality, we find that there is issue of accountability. There is issue of planning, engagement of the stakeholder in planning process and implementation and review. We have a voluntary national review. This is kind of celebration of what government has done. But often we ignore the engagement of the civil society and engagement of the key stakeholder. So how we can ensure meaningful participation of citizen and stakeholder so that we can empower our system that ensure adequate financing, better planning, and empower the teachers to perform their responsibilities. On top of that, we recently observed that EdTech is taking another step. So many government are trying to move to adopt EdTech, and there is rich-poor divide, and there is rural-urban divide. So with those, EdTech division is creating another problem. Many of the teachers are not trained adequately on the EdTech, and because of the cost of education, people are not participating in science, technology, engineering, and math. Particularly, girls are lagging much behind in participation of STEM. So we need to look into the strategic investment, kind of formula-based investment in education, and how the state can look into the access and equity issue, quality and relevance issue, and governance and management issues in education. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Namul. Thank you. Great finishing and bringing together all of those issues, and also from the perspective of Bangladesh. Now, we are not doing great with time, but we're going to allow a little bit of time for the Q&A because we have 3 questions. I don't know whether you can read them because I dropped out. I couldn't read them, but Fabiola has kindly posted them on the chat for me. Now, excuse my French, but it's going to, for people to be able to, for the translators to be able to translate it into the different languages. I'm going to try my best to read it. The first one I have here is, il faudra associer à cette campagne une enquête dont les résultats pourront renforcer les stratégies de la campagne et aussi intégrer les parlements des pays pour un suivi. Les organisations de la société civile et différents syndicats des enseignants, la participation de tous les acteurs est indispensable pour cette décolorisation. Pourquoi n'écoutez pas les enfants dans ce processus? So I don't know whether anyone would like to answer this until I see a hand up from the panelists. I'm going to put it in gallery so I can see. I'm going to say a little bit about the Tax Aid Alliance that I coordinate that brings together ActionAid, Education International, so the Federation of Teachers Unions that Haldis is the representative here. Also Tax Justice Network, Global Alliance for Tax Justice, and Global Campaign for Education. So we are bringing together actually, different constituencies, those working on education, those working on tax justice and economic justice issues, as well as the teachers' unions. And I think that, and we are doing this at local, national, and international level. I really think that bringing together, joining forces is the way to do that. And for that, and we need to be bringing evidence, right, for the advocacy from the local to the national level and also to the global level and back as well, because we are seeing that there are some changes particularly happening at global level. Leonardo was talking about the Transforming Education Summit that took place last year. Atilla and Magdalena were talking about the UN resolution led by the ministers of finance in Africa, right? That is going to be leading to a UN tax convention and UN tax body. The OECD, right? Like the influence that it has, but still at national level, the governments can do a lot and they really need to empower themselves and work together also regionally to say no to the austerity recommendations that the IMF is pushing for, no to the debt and debt repayment services, and this emphasis, which is almost like a cult of austerity that David Archer talks about, for just like always putting first debt repayment services and fiscal consolidation over human rights. This is a really bad economic recipe, and it's definitely bad for human rights. I don't know whether anyone else would like to answer this question, otherwise I will go for the second one, which again is in French, so sorry again. So, c'est vraiment impeccable. Je voulais savoir comment vous pouvez appuyer l'éducation chez les peuples autochtones qui sont dans la forêt équatoriale. So this is about indigenous groups. I don't know whether anyone would like to answer. Please put your hand up and help me out in here. No? Yeah. Haldis, you're putting your, please go ahead.
Well, I put my camera on. I don't know if I can answer such a specific question about a specific area, but I think it brings a very important point about the most hard to reach. And very often these are the rural areas in countries, and we all, governments and also other organizations, tend to start in a capital and work out where it's easiest to go. And I think it's very important that we advocate that you have to do the opposite. You have to try to find how you can support those that are furthest away. I can't talk about the specific geographical area because I don't know enough about it, but it is a general problem that we often don't get as far as where the people who really lack the infrastructure and the teachers to be able to receive education. And that's how I see the core of the question. You know, how can we reach those that actually don't have school buildings, that don't have schools, that don't have teachers, that are left out and forgotten? And I think often they are minority groups. And often you will have additional challenges, especially where they also then represent other language groups, that you may not have the materials that adapt. And that circles back to what I mentioned to begin with, that we have to see this as more than just an issue of north, south, and the old colonial structure, but also see it at how we serve minorities within our countries. And that is more expensive than just doing the mainstream, but we must keep voicing it collectively, as you said, Maria, because that's what the strength of the collective voice.
Sorry, thank you very much. I can see Mustafa with his hand up, and I don't know whether Manos, because I saw your camera popping up as well. So we will go with Mustafa, who raised his hand, and then we go with you. Okay, Manos, thank you.
Okay, I want to say, of course, I'm not an expert in the question that was raised, but I think I know what should be the approach. And I think, as was said in the whole discussion today, the best way to change the situation is to organize. And I think in this particular case, what we need is two types of organization. First of all, that the people locally have to self-organize themselves to demand their rights. And we have to organize at the level internationally, at the level of a solidarity movement that could push for them to achieve the goal they want and the rights they have to have. I think that is the main issue. It's to organize and look locally and globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mustafa. Manos?
From our perspective, what we can contribute, of course, as more technical people is data. Of course, the mapping of indigenous populations on the traditional survey data that we use is patchy. I mean, some countries document them, some countries less so, but we never miss an opportunity to draw attention to such communities. For instance, when we supported the preparation of a report on the G20 presidency last year of Indonesia, we had a graph where we compared the averages in terms of secondary education achievement among the 20 member states of the G20. But we also had a particular place for the most vulnerable group, which in some cases, like in the case of Canada, was First Nations, for instance, where the average achievement was lower than the lowest of the G20 member states average. That in itself
Please,
is one.
mute. We can hear you. Rafat, please mute. Sorry, Manas.
So again, it's indicative of the power of data. Likewise, when we had our report on equity and inclusion in the former transition countries, so Central and Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, we benefited from the high quality resources that UNICEF made available that offered the opportunity to not only disaggregate by ethnicity, but focusing primarily on the Roma communities, which are usually very hard to enumerate, given that they tend to live in areas that traditional surveys don't normally capture. So that in itself was another opportunity. So I think the power of data is what we can offer from our side, because unless you see it, it's difficult to remember it.
Thank you very much, Manos. And I would also add that when we are talking about education financing, we are talking about the 4 S's of the budget. Okay, so I was talking at the beginning about how we need to increase the share of education, but also how we need to increase the size through progressive tax reform. We also need to increase the sensitivity of the budget. And this is when disadvantaged group and indigenous group have been traditionally, like chronically actually, disadvantaged, particularly in education financing, could come, as well as gender transformative and inclusive, so children with disabilities as well. And the 4S is the scrutiny of the budget. And I have posted already on the chat an invitation to join us for the launch of the Transforming Education Financing Toolkit that will take place tomorrow. So please do join us. Now I'm going to pass over to Grant, who will be closing this webinar, and I would like to thank you all. Grant, over to you if you are here. And also, you can answer the last question. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, so thank you so much, for giving me this opportunity. I think, to answer the question, we do have, yes, a number of programs that, we are running as Global Campaign for Education. But, the issue around education financing to us isn't not just a project. I mean, this is something that is at the heart of the GCE movement. It is part of our strategic plan. It is something that, we're going to be working on until there is more resources in education. So this is something that, we are doing. For the Arab region, for those countries that, we are listed, we're working with the Teacher Creative Center and the Arab Campaign for Education to really mobilize the citizens, because this is what, we believe in strongly, that, if we bring the citizen in, if the civil society can lead, lobby the citizen, so that then we can all call on our governments to really put more resources into education. And from the different conversation that has happened here, we can see that it is possible to do so. All we just need is political will into the whole thing. And we will not stop as GCE working into to ensure that, there are more resources into education. And, we are so glad that, you were able to join this event, and we can promise you that, this will not be the end of this conversation. This discussion cannot just end here. This is something that we will continue up until the end of the year. And, thank you so much for all our panelists, for all the speakers, for really availing yourself. And we'll be reaching out to you for different conversations that, we would want to be having with you. Thank you so much to Maria, to David and ActionAid for supporting this whole thing, to Education International or UNESCO and everyone else who really made themselves available to this event. And lastly, to the Secretariat, GC Secretariat, for really putting in a lot of effort to get this campaign going. As I said, this is not the end of the campaign. This is just the beginning, because I feel like we have just scratched the surface. We really need to have deeper conversation about what does it mean to decolonize education. And when those resources are decolonized, how are they utilized? Because I think that is also another part that we need to discuss. But thank you so much, everyone, for making your time. And we'll ensure that these recordings for various sessions that we've had around this week are really made available to everyone. You should be able to access them via our GC website and many on Twitter and everything. Let's continue calling for education financing to be decolonized. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and all the panelists. Thank you. I forgot that we have this animation with all the cartoons that we have produced for the Global Action Week for Education as well. Please keep pushing it. Feel free to show it. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone.